Hello and welcome to Default to Saw, where we take on everything by default. I am your host, Demosthenes, and filling in for Mr. Kyle Nash this week, we got a returning guest, Mr. Jim. How's it going?
Going great, guy. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to talking about one of my favorite subjects of all time, and that is James Bond. Now, one of my favorite memories from college was sitting down with this man right here and watching every single James Bond film. I think we did that twice, if not more.
Yeah, so we actually did sit down and watch them all. That was shortly after we watched Lord of the Rings, the extended cut. That was a really great day.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Man, those Lord of the Rings movies straight in one day, that's like 13 hours just for those 3 movies. It's a good thing we didn't do the Bond films all in one go. That would have been, what, 48 plus hours? Probably, longer now. We
would have been as old as Roger Moore was.
Ouch. Poor Roger Moore. Rest in peace. So we're going to be talking about one of the biggest cinematic debates of all time. Who is the best James Bond? Now we're talking about over 50 years of films. We've had 6 official James Bonds. We've had Sean Connery, who did 6 films, 7 if you include his one unofficial one, Never Say Never Again. We had George Lazenby come in for just 1 on Her Majesty's Secret Service. Then we had Roger Moore, who did another 7. A remarkable run from 1973 until 1985. The man started doing Bond when he was 45 and ended it when he was, 56 or 7. Followed by Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and our latest Bond, Daniel Craig, who's going for his 5th and possibly final. We'll see. So how do you tackle the conversation of who is the best James Bond? Well, we decided that we're going to break it down to a few specific categories to help us get to that answer. So we're going to be discussing who is the best fighter, who is the most charming, who is the most plausible, and who is the funniest. So let's start with the best fighter. Jim, what do you think? Who do you think is the best James Bond fighter?
So for me, it's actually a tie. I think there's a lot of consideration you got to think about when you compare all the Bonds. You've got, like you said, over 50 years of cinematic history, different filmmakers, different directions. Even Ian Fleming changed the actual character of Bond in the books after he saw Sean Connery. So I feel like there's a lot of consideration that we have to kind of take into account for all these categories. But
the changing of the times being a big one. Exactly.
And I think Bond is refined over the course of the few years, or the years that he's been part of the culture. For me, like I said, it's a tie. It comes between Craig and Connery for me. Craig and Connery have this interesting kind of physique where it's not the same really as any of the other Bonds. They're built like boxers. And they fight like it. They fight like gutter fighters, but they're effective. They're not too super reliant on their gadgets to pull them out of trouble. They're really kind of trying to be more resourceful with whatever situation they're in, whether it be somebody coming at them with a shark or a golden gun, for example, or harpoons. They really they're the ones who I think really make the most out of what they physically can do, and I think that stands out as a big plus for both of them.
When I think of the best fighters, I think of 3 names, and you just named 2 of them, and the other one I consider, perhaps surprisingly to some, is George Lazenby. Now, he went on to study under Bruce Lee. He became kind of an adept martial artist himself, and his battle scenes in just that one film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, were brutal. I don't think there's ever been in the Bond who has delivered a more biting uppercut.
Oh, no. I would agree 100%. He's actually the next one on my list. I mean, you know how much I hate Lazenby, and I hate that movie. I got to give credit where credit's due, man. The guy knows his stuff, and he is a really good fighter. I 100% agree with you.
I do give the edge to Daniel Craig. He's number 1 in my book, just because he has his fight scenes are brutal. They're exciting to watch. They're a little bit more vulnerable. You see him bleed. Mm-hmm. But there's a higher variety in his fights.
The choreography of the fight scenes, especially with Craig, have been stellar. I mean, from Casino Royale to Skyfall, when you see Craig, he actually is improving. Like, you see him get a little bit more aggressive in certain situations, but he's also a little bit more calculating. He's not just throwing everything to the wind trying to win the fight. He's actually evolving as the Bond character, which you really don't get to see in much of the other ones.
So, okay, we got Daniel Craig and Sean Connery up there with a sweet call out to Mr. Lazenby, probably the highest he's going to make it on this list. But next we've got most charming.
It's funny you said that as the last lead into that question, because I actually have him as number 1.
Lazenby?
Yep.
As the most charming?
Yep.
Okay, explain this to me.
So while Lazenby doesn't have a whole lot of movies, obviously he was only in one. The nice thing is that while he only had that one moment in the spotlight, he came across as a genuine kind of guy, and the audiences could relate to him. And he did step into a big role where Connery had, pushed that franchise as far as he was going to, and just like, I quit. Lazenby stepped in and actually did a good job convincing the character, convincing the audience that he actually was Bond, and he wasn't crass. He wasn't really, to me, he wasn't over the top. I'm Bond, James Bond. Hello, Pussy Galore. Oh, of course you are. He wasn't that snide, snarky kind of Bond. It was.
I'm filtering that as an Australian playing an Englishman previously played by a Scotsman. No, Lazenby started his career as an underwear model.
Oh, thanks for putting that image in my head.
Anything I can do.
Jesus Christ. He's relatable as a character, whereas all the other ones, it's like, well, what do you think of when you think of James Bond? Well, let's see. He's sexy. He sleeps with all the women he possibly can. He's got great gadgets, a cool car, and he always just saves the day. Whereas this one was like, it's a human. You kind of care. And I feel like because they wrote it the way they did, because how he portrayed it, I don't think he's a hugely great actor, but I think in this instance, I think he was a little bit more charming than the rest.
He was definitely he's up there as the most romantic, and the screenplay did call for that a little bit more. I think the only two other Bonds that kind of hit that area well were probably Dalton and Daniel Craig. The thing about Lazenby, and there are a lot of detractors. A lot of people harp on his acting ability. It was his first film. In fact, probably the worst. The worst part of his performance is all due to ADR, where they added in gags in the line of the stuff that Connery would say, and always came out as fake. But he nailed it where it mattered. That death scene at the very end of the film, where he does get emotional, he nailed that. And for that, I can't condemn him. But as far as the most charming, when you break down the word charm, I kind of add a little bit of magnetic personality trait to it. Connery had that in spades. He could be brutal, and then he can be debonair. Well, I guess that kind of brings us to the question of plausibility. I've got Dalton as the most plausible. I can buy him existing in real life.
I would show this on the camera a bit. I know it's going to blanch out the crap out of it. I have Dalton as my number 1 on plausible. I think Dalton is more of a realistic Bond because I can buy him as a spy. When I say plausible, I mean I interpreted the category as plausible spy, somebody I can buy and be like, he's probably a spy, and I can get behind that. I have Dalton mostly because he just goes on a rampage when he gets totally screwed over. And he just goes, and he's all on his own, and he does it, and he redeems himself. But when you see him play a role, when you see Timothy Dalton play a role, he is that role. He absorbs all the aspects of that character.
He commits.
His facial expressions, his attitude, his character development that you feel like he made the character. I could see him as being a spy and being like, Yeah, that's the one I want to stay away from because he's got a license to kill me if I screw anything up around him.
Yeah, Dalton, I agree with you 100%. Dalton was, I buy him. I can buy this guy existing almost wholly formed. He takes his craft seriously. He was one of the last Bonds to really have any realistic vices. I mean, he smoked like a chimney. He wasn't a perfect character. He could be ruthless and a bastard, but he had this tender side. His romance in The Living Daylights, I thought was one of the sweetest in the whole series.
I would agree. And actually, fun fact, he was the very last Bond to smoke on camera.
A cigarette. I think,
cigarette.
Yeah,
You're right.
Yeah, Brosnan did smoke cigars, and I even remember articles coming out at the time saying, "Oh, Bond is teaching people to smoke."
Yeah. Okay. He's also the one because he uses a gun. You know what? We're not going to go into that political thing.
Well, I could just sum it up by saying that James Bond, if you're looking for cinematic role models, James
not
Bond
one to follow.
is not the one. He's not a role model. Screw it.
I mean, unless you want your kid to come home with like, gotta catch them all STDs, I wouldn't suggest it in a binge drinking problem. I don't think that's good.
I think we got the concept for the next Pokemon Go sequel.
Oh God, no. Chlamydia, I choose you. It's super effective.
Well, I don't want to drop the ball with this conversation.
Oh God. The worst.
I think what really pushes Dalton's Bonds to the top of my list, especially, is there's one scene in The Living Daylights where he basically breaks into a hotel, threatens a general. He's very brutal, practically in an uncomfortable way, but there's nothing out of the realm of possibility in that scene. It's the closest of an interpretation of the novel Bond on screen, and that performance, that seriousness that he brought to the role, that dark side, really, I know a lot of people tend to throw around the word dark as as this pejorative pretty much, but with Dalton, it never came across as forced or faked or wedged in just so we can have this moment. It came across as natural to the character. I don't think anybody has done it better than him for at least that aspect of the character.
I would agree. The intensity came across as natural. He stepped into the role. He took it over, and he did everything he could with it to make it as good as it was. And you're right. I mean, I think he's probably one of the better Bonds. He just got the short end of the stick when it came to those lawsuits with GoldenEye.
So we got Timothy Dalton as the most plausible, which brings us to the other end of the treat. We're talking about the funniest James Bond. Out of all of these, this was the easiest one for me. It has to be Roger Moore.
That it is. That's the only one he comes on number one on my list.
Like I said, with Roger Moore, I mean, he did do some other films at the time where he was doing Bond, where he took on a more serious role, and he was great at it. I'm thinking of the Sea Wolves. Especially because he pretty much played a variation of Bond in Casino Royale. He had that tragic, duplicitous love story in that film, and he was damn good in it. He was the Bond that the series needed at the time, and if it wasn't for that, the series would never ever have continued past Connery. And he was damn good at it. His comedy came off as natural to the fantasy of the story around him. Most importantly, when he said those witty one-liners, half the time they worked, and the other half, whenever they didn't, you still smiled. You still loved the fact that there was a joke, his delivery, his smile. You could just sit back and really just watch these films and just have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why he came on number one for me. Is like, if when I ever have kids, I'll show Roger Moore movies to them to introduce them to Bond, because it's easy for them to get into. It's not something you got to pay a whole lot of attention to. It's very comical, but it's also it's exactly what you said. I mean, it's a more approachable Bond, and it gets you into it without delving into the darker side. And it's just, it is what it is. It's enjoyable.
I think that when people think about the James Bond series, those that maybe are unaware of many of the films, when they think of the caricature of Bond as the superhero spy who gets all the girls and uses all the cool gadgets and has the submarine cars and all this crazy jazz, they're picturing Roger Moore.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Bond that Roger Moore played and popularized, and he fits all. He's the definition of all those tropes.
You're right. He's absolutely the godfather of those tropes in modern cinema, and I like to think that he's probably the closest to Ian Fleming being Bond, because Fleming did a lot of crazy stuff in World War II, and that's where he got a lot of his experience with the people he worked with. And one of the terms that they were called were gentlemen bastards, and I don't think that Moore is really a bastard in a lot of them, but he comes across as probably what Ian Fleming generally, like a prototype, envisioned Bond to be.
Perhaps without the brutal edge, because
yes,
the Bond of the novels, like I said before, Dalton in that one scene in Living Daylights really epitomized what the novel Bond character was. Maybe this helps us in getting to the final answer of who really is the best overall Bond. Here's the thing with me. I don't necessarily have a favorite. I view the Bond films in a different way than many people do. I really view them as this interesting perspective to gauge how action films have evolved over the years. And every Bond actor is indicative of that time in cinema and audience taste. So I don't necessarily, there isn't a single Bond that I necessarily hate or really dislike. But as far as personal taste, Connery is always going to, at least up to this point, is always going to be number one for me, because he hits, if you look at these lists of requisites, and we picked categories that are more aligned with what the actor brings to the film than his co-stars and scripts and so forth. So it really boiled this down to the actor's abilities, and Connery hits them all pretty well.
I'm not super disagreeing with you on that. I think you and I are going to differ pretty hard on this list. I tend to have the more recent Bonds higher, because I love that nitty gritty. I love the dark humor. I love the dark situations. For me, I like Craig the best because you see a much more refined evolution from Casino Royale to Quantum of Solace to Skyfall to Spectre. I feel like you see Bond getting to be Bond instead of just Bond from day one. I have respect for it. I absolutely respect Connery and all the other Bonds, even Lazenby. But I feel like...
Yeah, Spectre could be argued that it is the most fully formed Bond that he did.
Yeah.
As far as like comparison to the classic films.
I would definitely agree. And I just saw that movie last week, finally. Sorry, Demos. But, I mean, you're right. He's definitely much more... You feel like you have almost a little bit more invested in it because you've kind of gone along with him on that journey. And I'm not one for reboots. I'm not one for retelling of the same story and over again. But to your point that you just brought up before, it's basically like every single Bond is their own period piece. I mean, each Bond, like you said, each Bond had a different directive style. Each Bond had different music. Each Bond had different attitudes and characteristics that the other Bonds didn't quite have, but it was all sourced in the time that they were. And
with certain holdovers from the previous iteration as well.
But not enough to detract from
exactly.
Them. They never got in the way. I mean, even with crap movies like Moonraker and Diamonds Are Forever, it got real campy real quick, but that was the time. I mean,
But you know, I'm glad you bring that up because that was the brilliance of the series. The best thing they did was every single time they actually hit that line of this is getting way too fantastic. He's in volcanoes, he's in space, he's in an ice palace. The very, very next film is always one of the most down-to-earth Bond films. So, I mean, you go from You Only Live Twice to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, from Moonraker to For Your Eyes Only, from Die Another Day to Casino Royale. The follow-up film is always much more down-to-earth. And I think that keeps it from going too far.
I would agree. It keeps it balanced because it's almost like the Star Trek movies. The other ones, with the exception of a couple, the odd ones and the evens, they have good and bad, but mostly they're attributed to one of those two. But with the Bond ones, they have that formula almost perfected. Where, like you said, it's a two-stroke. They do a good solid one, do a slightly out there one, but that brings the next one up that they can get away with a little bit more. And then a little bit more. And it continuously is a series that builds on itself. And that's one of the best things I love about Bond, where you can sit down and watch any single one of them and enjoy it for a different reason. Each Bond is a different one. And while they are, as you and I have argued for many, many years, the same person as Bond, they're all, in my mind, different Bonds because of what they bring to the table for each individual actor. Overall, I would say Daniel Craig, Pierce Brosnan, Timothy Dalton, and then I would go Connery, Moore, and then Lazenby.
Huh. Okay. So you weren't kidding. You really do have all the most recent right up front. I got Daniel Craig at number 2, followed by Timothy Dalton, followed by Roger Moore, Brosnan, and then Lazenby. And Roger Moore is like kind of like the odd duck in there because I honestly, if I'm ever looking for a fun Bond film to just sit back and just, shoot the shit with, it tends to be a Roger Moore film because they are the most, there's kind of a joyous thing about watching one of those films, especially his later.
They're wholesome.
Yeah. Where, and it does call back to an age where movies didn't have as much hang-ups as they do now. You can just have fun. Nobody took them seriously. And anybody trying to take one of these older Bond films seriously is only going to give themselves a headache of their own causing. But yeah, Timothy Dalton is a little high on my list just because I think he's the most underrated of the James Bonds, and if he had done more, I think he would have attained the credit that he's only really now starting to get.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think it's interesting the differences we had, but I feel like we've kind of we've balanced it out. I don't think there's going to be a quintessential best, but I think it really depends on what you're in the mood for. Just like you said with Roger Moore, if you want something lighthearted, if you want something a little bit more classic but also fun and entertaining, you got Sean Connery. If you want something a little bit modern, you got Daniel Craig. If you want war stuff, or nitty gritty, you got Dalton and early Brosnan. And if you just want the odd one out, go with Lazenby or Peter Sellers. Whatever.
Yeah, if you ever want to have a drug trip, watch the 1967 Casino Royale, which is one of the oddest films I have ever seen. It has one of the biggest casts ever assembled.
Half of which are James Bond.
Yeah, half of which do the James Bond codename theory. I wonder where it came from. And God. Funny enough, though, it stars David Niven as the legitimate James Bond, which was Ian Fleming's primo choice to play Bond. And David Niven does play a lot of serious roles. He has that dry sense of humor. If he was younger, I can see him being Bond, but not in the same style as the cinematic Bond, eventually became.
Kind of hurt you put Brosnan so low, but, I can understand.
Somebody, once again, I think that he's kind of like an amalgamation of what came before. And Somebody had to be at the bottom, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. I'll let it slide this time.
I like Brosnan. I really enjoy Brosnan. I think he still could be playing James Bond. If he had still been playing James Bond, he never would have sung in Mamma Mia. Let that sink in. Or Mamma Mia 2. Here we go again. That's not a title. That's a comment on the fact that it exists.
The man needs money. What do you want?
You play some Baccarat. Make some of that. Do you think that an actor who had played James Bond could ever go to a casino and lose? They'd never be able to walk into a casino again.
Yeah, but you know they probably don't know how to play Baccarat.
Yeah, that's the reason why in Casino Royale, the new iteration, they went for Texas Hold'em instead of Baccarat because they're afraid that nobody was going to understand it. But
it's a very classic game, but it's kind of died out. I mean, I don't even remember all the rules. I think I played it once, and I still got confused on it.
Well, Jim, that pretty much does it for today's episode. Thank you for joining me and sharing your insights.
But of course.
Well, all I can say is good night, Mr. Bond, and make sure to follow me on Hilarity by Default every week for tons of fun stuff, on Twitter at Default Hilarity, and on Facebook, Hilarity by Default. Join us next week, where our regular co-host, Mr. Kyle Nash, will be back. Once again, thank you, Jim, and remember that life is hilarious by default.